I think Maria will start. Could you take the slide off, please? Thank you.
Great. Hello and welcome, everyone. We are here to talk about strengthening pathways from evidence to action today, a very exciting and important topic. My name is Marie Garter, and I'm the Executive Director of the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, or also known as 3IE. 3IE is an international NGO that promotes evidence-informed, equitable, inclusive, and sustainable development. We support the generation and effective use of high-quality evidence to inform decision-making in low and middle-income countries. We provide guidance and support to produce, synthesize, and quality assure evidence of what works, for whom, why, and at what cost. We have offices in New Delhi, London, and Washington, D.C. And of course, in this day and age, we also have staff in many other parts of the world. Decision makers can use research evidence to diagnose development problems, inform program design, or any stage during the policy and implementation process. To improve the chances that this happens, it is critical to understand the factors that facilitate or limit evidence-informed decision-making. So through today's session, we hope to share lessons learned from promoting the use of evidence in low and middle-income countries, and also throw light on how monitoring and evaluation results and research evidence get translated to action and impact. We will start with a presentation using lessons from 3IE's work in tracking evidence uptake, which we do in part by using contribution tracing methods. We will show you our recently launched portal of evidence impact summaries that showcases how different decision makers have used research evidence and the factors that affect the use of evidence in decision making. Given our mission to support the generation and use of evidence for development, we are very happy to be part of the National Conference on Monitoring, Evaluation and Learning, organized by DMEO and NITI Aayog. Now I'd like to introduce today's exciting panel. Let's start, and I'm happy to welcome Sunita Krishnan, who is the India Country Office Deputy Director, Strategy, Planning and Management and Evaluation of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Next, S. Krishnan, who is the Additional Chief Secretary, Finance of Tamil Nadu. We're also joined by Samir Sundar Das, Senior Rural Development Specialist of the World Bank. And last but not least, Emmanuel Jimenez, also known as Manny Jimenez, who is a Senior Fellow of 3IE, and many of you will know him as the former Executive Director of 3IE. And we also have Kirti Rao, my colleague from 3IE, who is going to be making a short presentation before the panel discussion. You can find their detailed and excellent, exciting bios in the link which my colleagues have added in the chat. Also, in the spirit of continuous mutual learning, the panelists will also be asking each other questions about how to deal with challenges in terms of evidence uptake, or about possible solutions that they have heard in the other panelists' introductory remarks. Now, before kicking off the panel and the panel discussions, here are a few housekeeping notes. When sending questions to the panel, please use the Q&A box for questions, and please name the panelist you would like a response from. We also suggest that if you go to layout on the WebEx screen, you use the grid layout throughout this webinar, so you can actually see all of the panelists and their reactions to each other's questions and comments. We would encourage our audience to live tweet, tagging 3IE's Twitter handle, which is @3IE News, and using hashtag IndiaMelConf, so IndiaMelConf, which is the conference official hashtag. But before launching the panel, let me start by requesting my colleague Kirti Rao to make a short presentation to set the stage for the panel discussion. Kirti is an evidence impact specialist at 3IE, and she will share what we mean by evidence-informed decision-making and the need for it. Her presentation draws from our evidence impact monitoring data to highlight factors that support or constrain the use of research. So over to you, Kirti.
Thanks a lot, Marie. If we can have the presentation, please. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Marie, for that introduction. And I think over the past few days, we've been discussing about how robust M&E systems and evidence, having an accessible stock of knowledge and cumulative learning is extremely critical for evidence-informed decision-making. But it is our belief that to address, and actually make evidence-informed decision-making real, this cumulative learning has to flow into action and decision making, and that's a whole different puzzle. And in this presentation, we will talk about some of the levers that can help address the challenges which actually prevent evidence-informed decision making in the real world, or challenge it at any rate. So in this presentation, we will first begin by talking about what we mean by evidence-informed decision-making, and then go over to some of these factors that can help address and improve the chances that evidence of different kinds actually finds its way into decision-making. The next slide, please. Can you click on all of them? So what do we mean by evidence-informed decision-making? EIDM is the process whereby decision makers consult the best available evidence in a systematic and transparent way to help guide agenda setting, policy development and revision, as well as implementation decisions. And by evidence, here we mean the most locally applicable, best quality and relevant learning and insights. So not just M&E data or evidence from research studies, but cumulative learning from multiple sources. Can we go to the next slide, please? And evidence-informed decision-making has actually a very important track record of improving decision-making and practice. And this is something that actually has widespread acceptance. Time and again, we see examples of evidence, be it from studies, data, or other learning, guiding decision makers. And sharing just two examples from our recently launched Evidence Impact Summaries portal, this particular case that we have on here talks about how in Gujarat, the industrial pollution audit scheme was actually facing many challenges, and how study findings on the importance of having independent auditors and predefined audit fees led the Gujarat Pollution Control Board to make changes in its audit scheme in 2015 and actually start addressing that issue. The next slide, please. Similarly, in Ghana, this is related to the LEAP cash transfers. An evaluation found that the cash transfers, although beneficial, were too small and irregular, because of which they weren't actually able to fulfill a consumption smoothing function. And the study findings, actually, among many other factors, helped the government and prompted them to make the transfers larger in size and more regular since 2014. So while there is this widespread agreement about the importance of evidence-informed decision-making, why is it that it's been so challenging in practice and so difficult in practice? And this particular political science framework, can we go to the next slide, please? Which is basically the multiple streams framework, seemed very familiar to us, and it kind of showed what we see regularly while we track evidence uptake and use. What it shows is that the policy process is so complex, and it's often, it's rarely evidence-based, and at best, it is evidence-informed. And decisions are usually informed by a mix of ideas about a problem, the so-called problem stream, many political and interest groups that have a bearing on how the issue is framed, which is the politics stream, as well as the evidence and all the cumulative learning, which is the policy stream about a particular issue. And decisions are usually informed by a mix of these, and at different times, different streams might have a bigger impact. And we actually believe that this complexity is not a bad thing. Interest groups, of course, matter, and available evidence too can be limited in some ways. So how is it, what are the factors that help give the policy stream and evidence a seat at the table in the making of policies or in agenda setting or in informing implementation? What we've seen what we've seen matters is of course chance to actually have policy windows and opportunities for all of these streams to align. What also matters is the efforts of different researchers to be timely and relevant, of the academia and knowledge stream, so to speak. There is, of course, the efforts of evidence champions among decision-making authorities. What also seems to matter is humble and reflective and learning-focused cultures, right, within decision-making bodies. So all of these improve the chances that the problem, policy, and politics stream align and improve the chances of evidence-informed decision-making. Can we go to the next slide, please? Just to reiterate some of these factors for strengthening the pathways from evidence to action, another way to think about it is in terms of the factors that need thinking and action around, right? So, of course, what's important is capacity within the government or within the implementing agency to access and consider the best available knowledge or evidence. We also need capacity within the M&E community to be quality, relevant, and timely. What's also key is buy-in and ownership from different levels and arms of the implementing agency, and especially the levels that are closest to the implementation, right? Unless they take evidence on board and learning on board, evidence-informed decision-making is going to be very hard. Another factor that's important is the linkages or the interactions and trust and individual champions, easing the flow of evidence into decision-making. Another factor is, of course, incentives. This could be systemic or individual incentives. So researcher incentives to engage and explain, as well as decision makers' incentives to be evidence informed and to also support the champions among their peer group. And another factor that kind of overlaps with this and makes this happen is culture and institutions, right? What are the factors that give importance to accountability, learning, and transparency, and create that environment of being all right with criticism, which is what often evidence throws up, right? Can we move to the next slide? Definitely not, by no means the domain of a single organization. They definitely need an entire ecosystem to work together. And for our part, we stress on the importance of developing capacity through, for example, making evidence accessible through our development evidence portal. We also stress on the importance of building relationships, early and ongoing stakeholder engagement, also being demand-driven and responsive through partnerships and through actions such as our recently launched help desk services. And how is this actually helped? Can we go to the next slide, please? Our monitoring data shows that there are 7 broad types in which change is informed by evidence. These 7 types that you see on your screen, they're not just about scaling up or scaling down. They're actually much more nuanced. And all of these types of ways in which evidence-informed decision-making are drawn from our practice, as well as the theory around evidence use. So as shown here, we're listing them alphabetically because we value each of them equally, considering how difficult it is to make for accumulated knowledge to make any impact on decision making, right? So each of them are valuable. If you want to know more about our evidence use typology or what I discussed during this presentation, feel free to please visit our website. And thanks for listening. And I think back to Marie.
Excellent. Thank you, Kirti. Now, both you and I have mentioned this evidence impact portal. And so could we please see it? And maybe
Sure.
you could show us an example of, for example, the instance number 6 or the type number 6 you just showed of informing the design of other programs. And maybe let's pick an example from India. Let's see if you could bring that up.
Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Great. So we are actually in our evidence impact summaries portal. You can find it in our evidence hub. And as Marie said, we are interested in looking at instances where evidence actually informed the design of other programs. So you can either go through this drop-down menu, and we are looking for examples from India. So I'm just going to quickly scroll down to India. And yeah, there it is. So within a particular evidence impact summary, we actually start with the highlights of the case, how the evidence has made a change. We also look into the factors that seem to have contributed to that evidence-informed decision making. For those who are interested in the details of the study, they can find this on the portal itself, along with details of how the evidence has made a change, and our typology is described in one of those I buttons, which didn't really load because of the internet, I'm guessing. You can also read about our approach for how we measure evidence use through this link here. So I think I'll stop there, Marie, and hand it over to you. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you very much. And I think this is an excellent introduction and sort of gives a nice framework for some of the discussion that we will have with the panel. So let me jump straight in and introduce you and ask you, Krishnan, because you have been an evidence champion within the government. What in your mind are either important factors or considerations when trying to integrate evidence into decision making? What has worked for you in championing the cause of evidence-informed decision making? You're on mute. Yeah.
Thank you very much for having me on this panel, and I think it's an excellent initiative by DMEO to hold this conference on evaluation and evidence. I think it's critical to governance increasingly. For us, I think the most important thing is resources are always constrained, and you need to get the best results for whatever limited funds are available. And even within a large number of programs, it's difficult to actually wind down large programs. So what you're looking for very frequently is incremental improvements and changes. And that's where how you go about doing those incremental changes and improvements, it becomes critical to have adequate input, policy input in terms of what has worked, what has not worked, and how best you do it on the basis of evidence. In a previous position that I held as Secretary Planning and Development, we had two or three important departments which dealt with evidence and producing evidence. One was, I was Planning and Development Secretary, so we had the Directorate of Evaluation and Applied Research, which basically does evaluation of a given set of 20 to 25 programs a year within the state government to understand how they're working. And then we have the Directorate of Economics and Statistics, which collects a large volume of data. We also realized that increasingly with the computerization of a lot of back-end operations in government, there's a large volume of administrative data which gets collected, which is rarely analyzed. Now, these are precisely the kind of things that we need to analyze more effectively and see whether we can use it to inform next level decisions. I mean, when you produce usable evidence out of all this data that you collect. Equally, I think interface with a number of organizations and educational and academic institutions outside government also helped a lot. In 2014, we entered into a MOU with JPAL to do a lot of evidence-based policy making. Plus, I mean, apart from the standard RCTs, there's this whole process of a policy dialogue that you talk to different departments and find out what are the issues you want to tackle. If you spoke to the health department, they would say that the big policy questions I have right now is how do I tackle, say, non-communicable diseases, or how do I reduce maternal mortality, which seems to have hit a plateau. Then Then you're looking at what are the kind of programs you need to decide, what is the international evidence relating to this, how do you tackle, say, for instance, in the education department or the nutrition department, how do you tackle early childhood education as an effective, what has worked in other countries, what is likely to work somewhere else. And so the important thing here is trying to harness what is the decision support mechanisms within government, enhance their capacity, look at what are best practices internationally, see what kind of capacity you can build within the system, plus being open to wherever the evidence is coming in. Shamik, who's joined us here, is a task leader for an important poverty alleviation program, which works primarily with women in Tamil Nadu. And we've used them extensively. The Social Observatory of the World Bank did an interesting set of studies for us in an earlier version of this program, which has proved very useful as a tool that we can adapt elsewhere. So the important thing is create value for people who are in policy-making positions as to how the quality of decision-making can improve, how you can get better value for money, how there is a wealth of information available from other parts of the world, other states, plus how the ongoing programs that we have can be evaluated, studied, monitored, plus data can be accumulated from a variety of other sources to study this. I think once people are shown these possibilities, it certainly interests a lot of them. And thereafter, there is this hunger within the government system also that you're looking to see how this data can be harnessed. And a very valid point was made by the earlier presenter on timeliness, because very often the time available with policymakers is very limited. I mean, sometimes you're put into constraints where you have to make a very quick decision. Sometimes there's a political push, sometimes there's an interest group push. So having a backup in terms of information which can flow in is always useful. I mean, even very sensitive decisions. I recall a few years ago, we needed to take a decision on, what we do with prohibition. There was a moving demand saying we must enforce prohibition in the state. So will it work? Won't it work? What is the policy evidence internationally? And we had a couple of academic institutions and others help us with the collection of international experience and evidence on this, plus some data and evidence within the state, which we could use to actually devise a policy which finally worked, and so that we don't get into a disastrous policy spiral. So I think that becomes very important. And, with informed societies, a lot more of this data keeps coming in. And that's where I think 3IE or DMEO or JPAL or, the ISI or any other institution we work with is then in a position, I think, to reflect back very quickly. And one thing I really increasingly notice that a lot of academicians, researchers, and academic institutions want to engage with policymakers on a real-time basis. And they are ready and prepared to come in with a lot of information, data from their research. And that's something which we need to use a lot more. And same thing goes for agencies like even the World Bank, because increasingly we use them. We use them, of course, for funding, but in addition to funding, we also use them a lot in terms of what's happening elsewhere. Because, if you take the World Bank or any portfolio of external projects, I have a budget of about 300,000 crores a year. All the external money put together is probably 10 or 15,000 crores. So it's a very small proportion of my budget in terms of finance. But what we are looking at there is we are looking at models which we can then scale up. We are looking at things that we can do in that project which will inform the rest of policy making. We are looking at, what makes that difference and what can we take back into the rest of the government system to implement.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I mean, I think it's quite interesting. It is quite a hopeful and optimistic scenario that you're laying out for us of increasing understanding and hunger, as you put it, for evidence and increasing amount of data that is able to feed the processes. And then it sounds like what you're encountering is also partners in the evaluation landscape that are increasingly understanding how to be useful into the processes in a timely, real-time fashion. So quite a positive sort of image, which is very nice to hear. Now, one thing you did highlight as well is, of course, the ongoing, will always be there maybe, but resource constraints. And in that regard, let me then bring in you, Sunita, because the Gates Foundation is, of course, is known to take evidence very seriously and is also a huge contributor to finance and bring out more evidence for development. Now, as a big organization, how do you ensure that evidence informs future programming and funding decisions within the foundation? And also, if you could talk to what you have learned as a foundation about what it takes to build a learning culture, and how do you bring these lessons into your work with the government of India?
Great, thank you so much, Marie, and thanks as well to 3IE and DMEO for this invitation. And let me start off by saying we don't see ourselves, and I don't think we are a particularly big organization where, our budget, our role, our ability to have impact is way smaller than the kind of impact that Mr. Krishnan talked about, and that the government of India and the state governments of India can have. So with that, let me start with the first part of your question, which is how do we ensure that evidence informs the foundation's programming and funding decisions. My colleague and country director, Hari Menon, described yesterday some of the principles that guide our use of evidence. But let me kind of dig into that a little bit more and provide a little bit more detail. So, in brief, we use evidence across our strategy lifecycle. It's a starting point for our strategic planning efforts. So evidence helps us determine what we're working towards, within what time frame can we expect to achieve certain goals, and how can we go about attempting to achieve our goals. And given that we partner with governments in India, with the central and state governments, particularly the governments of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, as well as other partners, on a range of highly complex and in some cases even wicked problems, from tackling maternal and neonatal mortality to the financial empowerment of the most vulnerable populations, our strategies are almost always incomplete. That is, we have an incomplete picture of how change can happen. The pathway to impact will likely have many twists and turns, not all of which we're able to predict at the outset. So in this situation, it becomes essential to use measurement, evaluation, and evaluation for learning so that we can iteratively revise our understandings of how impact can be achieved and thereby adjust our approach, including our funding decisions and programming. So then moving to the second part of your question, which is what have we learned about building a learning culture? And here my response is definitely more tentative. While our commitment to using evidence, to measuring, evaluating, and learning is certainly deep, we are still very much practicing how to do this and how to do this consistently and well. And there are a couple of insights that I can share with you. The first has to do with the importance of paying attention to process, how evidence is produced and used. Building a learning culture is predicated on the quality of dialogue, participation, and collaboration among all those who need to be part of shaping that culture. And I think Mr. Krishnan really described that very well. So this includes, for us, not just our foundation team, but also our partners, our grantees, and importantly, the central and state governments that, and other development partners we work with, including partners like 3IE. We've realized that we need to invest in time upfront for co-creation of the monitoring, research, and evaluation agenda, spend time selecting the appropriate methods, establishing consistent, ongoing, and timely check-ins and feedback loops. And this is really hard, and I would say we still have a lot to improve on. The second point is related to process, but I want to call it out because it affects the quality of the process. And those are the relationships in the environment that's created for learning. If all those part of the learning system for shaping the learning culture are comfortable with each other, have personal bonds, and operate with trust and reciprocity, a vibrant learning culture emerges. Learning also needs to be fun. So during 2020, due to our homebound existence and because of the highly dynamic and unpredictable nature of the pandemic, we engaged in a lot of real-time learning. The crisis brought many of us together. We divided up the responsibilities, used all the information, however imperfect that information was, and we adjusted our programming on the go. And we used humor, personal stories, introduced our pets and family members to keep our spirits up. And all of this helped create a vibrant practice of learning. And I think the challenge that faces us now is how do we sustain this? Let me pause there because I have more I can share, but there are many more interesting panelists to hear from. Over.
No, great. That's very interesting thoughts, and I think what particularly resonates, and I think is something which is increasingly everybody you kind of know it, but increasingly being practiced is of course this idea of paying attention to the process and the right people being involved. The engagement throughout the personal relationships, all of that being such an important part of ensuring the best possible sort of diagnosis and use of evidence. So with that, let me introduce the next panelist, because Sami, you have been an active collaborator on one of 3IE's flagship evaluation programs, which evaluates the National Rural Livelihoods Project. And indeed, it's an example where the World Bank, the Gates Foundation, the Government of India, 3IE, and many others have been engaging very actively throughout. And so how important has the evidence-informed approach been to the World Bank Group's continued support for this program? I believe it just recently launched a new phase. And have you and the World Bank learned anything from this engagement with the Government of India that you also can, that you can bring elsewhere and use elsewhere in the work of the bank?
Thank you, Mary. To begin with, I would like to thank DMEO, NITI Aayog, 3IE for having me as part of this panel. And this is a very relevant learning discussion today, strengthening pathways for evidence to action. First of all, let me try to emphasize the two key words here, evidence to action. But honestly speaking, historically, it's mostly been action to evidence, and the good part is that this is shifting more towards evidence to action now. And the evaluation is because of the good quality body of evidence that is getting generated, and the openness to accept evidence-based learning, and the culture of evidence to action is evolving somewhat rapidly in India and also in various states of India. However, some fundamental question still remains on the evidence side, which I would like to pose in this forum, is when and who is generating this evidence, how this evidence is generated, how is the evidence is validated, how it is valued by key stakeholders, how it is put into actions in designing program policies towards addressing development challenges. I think these are the broad questions which still are asked in various evidence-based kind of approach to policy making and program designing. The moment you talk about evidence, it usually perceived as, or rightly so, as evaluating schemes, program interventions that will judge program effectiveness in terms of achieving targets, outcomes, hence performance. But what is more important, in my view, is when you go for evidence gathering, the new areas of debate and perspectives open up, which provides the opportunity for questioning relevancy of policies, program design, schemes, allocations, and the processes that we follow. And this strengthens the quality of learning and convert it into action. I think the whole point of learning and cumulative learning is driven out of this kind of approach that we're taking, that evidence-based approach could be more than just creating data for defining program effectiveness, but also creating a culture of debate and question and learning from that process. As you may all know, the World Bank, each of our projects are accountable to our institutional results matrix, kind of a results system that ensures that the projects are structured around a theory of change, which mandates us to measure progress through output tracking or evaluate end outcomes through various internal monitoring reporting systems. Some of them like the implementation status reports or the implementation completion results report at the outcome level, or other MIA-based monitoring system or administrative data that we may use to find out what is the change that we are trying to bring about. These result systems to a great extent help put together a body of evidence as knowledge for future use. Internally, we refer to a lot of ICRs of many of our projects to fall back on evidence to design new projects. It's a kind of a cyclical learning process because of the result system that we have in place actually within the World Bank institution as a mandate. Moreover, we also do a lot of standalone analytical work that contributes to a repository of knowledge to drive evidence. Hence, as an institution, we value and aspire to evidence-driven to the extent possible to help design programs and influence and advise on policies. We support the government not just in NRLM or through an NRLP and have a dedicated M&E component for us to be able to understand the impact of investment the bank has made. Has the project been able to deliver on its objectives, outcome, what worked and what didn't work? At the same time, effective M&E allow us to determine further investment or scaling of certain programs. So this is the overall kind of a mandate around which we operate in our M&E and evidence space. The design elements, if you look at the entire NRLP, the National Rural Livelihood Project, which was incubated in a way to actually launch and stabilize NRLM, the design elements of most of the World Bank assisted projects is influenced by or informed by evidence. For instance, the NRLP, the National Rural Livelihood Project, drew upon the experiences and evidences generated by the various state-specific World Bank assisted project in undivided Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Bihar, Odisha, Madhya Pradesh, and Rajasthan. So it's coming out of a process of learning and evidence that we have generated over the years. And what Mr. Krishnan referred to as the social observatory work in Tamil Nadu, Bihar, and Odisha provided the required evidence base to design NRLP to establish NRLM in the country, basically. Similarly, the design of NRETP, the second phase of NRLP, the National Rural Economic Transformation Project, which you mentioned now, was influenced by the results of pilots that we initiated under NRLP, as well as the recommendation made in third-party assessment of NRLM, which was done through IRMA, and various periodic assessment. The World Bank and the Ministry of Rural Development also makes required changes in implementation strategy based on MIS data, and also the evaluations we do otherwise with various other partners. As part of this evidence-based approach, a large-scale evaluation covering around 27,000 households has been conducted with the help of 3IE, and an evaluation at such scale with rigor was possible only because the government and various multiple partners valued this approach, which included the World Bank, BMGF, 3I, IRMA, amongst many others who are partnered in this process. And this has actually created an ecosystem around M&E in around this program, I would say. And the key being that the government was open to such a large kind of a scale evaluation. And it was a big step for us to see that the government was open for such a large scale evaluation. And this has brought in immense learning for other ministries, departments wanting to evaluate the effectiveness of work. So I think that it is an example in itself in India to have such evaluation and the government being open to such a big evaluation. I will refer to some of the findings that has come out from this evaluation. But for example, the findings showed that the investments in community institutions were paying up. SCG members involved household income, but also were linked to VO, village organization and cluster level federation households reporting higher expenditure on education, improvements in women confidence. This is important because the next generation projects are looking at investing in building capacity of this community institution, whether in the form of model CLFs or producer groups, where we are investing in the right direction. So I think there is this kind of evidence which is coming out. What in RLM, in RLP, in RLM have invested in have showing some results, so we can see how we can actually scale up some of this intervention or have to reject some of these things to the evolving situation. I was just looking at the engagement with MORD and GUI that is useful elsewhere. Though this is its engagement, my belief is in investing in building system and onboarding the right kind of technical partners has to be reinforced in various government programs. In particularly in complex programs like LR and RLM, it is crucial that we institutionalize monitoring, learning, and evaluation right from the outside. I think that the process of bringing it upfront and trying to create these systems is very important. Further, I would like to replicate the way the results of the evaluation are being disseminated in other projects as well. We are happy to note that 3IE is conducting state level dissemination, which involves answering state specific questions, which is a very important aspect in a federal structure like India, that we do a meta evaluation or a mega evaluation at the national level, but how do we bring it down to the state level and have the dialogue of the results that are coming out? Quite often the results of our evaluation exercise ends with the publication of report or paper. However, this engagement with the implementing partners means that they too have a chance to contextualize the finding. And in this case, the implementing partners being the state governments or the departments of the state governments. I think this is really important and something that needs to continue. Of course, like various other activities, there are challenges we are facing. Sometimes the aim of the evaluation and the intended outcomes does not necessarily interest the academic point of view of what has to be investigated. So there's a huge kind of attention there. While the evaluation exercise should be rigorous, it should also be complemented in a relatively quick time. I think this point was also been made by Mr. Krishnan in terms of the timeliness of evaluations. There is a need for a right balance in doing these evaluations, and to what extent they are be able to deliver on time to the client, basically. The cost is perceived to be high and for gathering evidence. So how do we work around that aspect of making sure the cost aspects are taken care of and government is willing to take up this cost? And lastly, the most important point is leadership and the organizational culture for looking at evidence and asking the right question, what we know or don't know to be better. I think these are some of the points from my side on how I look at evidence to action going forward.
Excellent, thank you, Sami. This is great points, and I'd like to just highlight a couple of things because so what you partly said as well is really interesting. To having one ministry, in this case, Ministry of Rural Development, sort of being in itself maybe a champion and an example for other ministries, that might be a very interesting way for sort of systematizing this across government. The other thing as well that has also been a learning for 3IE is this immense richness of the data. That when you do large evaluations, you have the baseline. That in itself is extremely precious evidence, and bringing that to the state level, I think, is a really worthwhile lesson to bring, and something certainly we've in 3IE seen the huge value of and huge demand. Let me now bring in you, Manny, as you know, you have been part of World Bank in various positions, and later you were at the helm of 3IE, and in all these roles you have actively engaged with country governments to evidence-informed decision making. So what, in your perspective, is the secret recipe for ensuring government ownership of evaluation programs? And what is it that you think the evaluators often get wrong when working with policymakers?
Thanks, Marie. And first of all, thanks again to DMEO and NITI Aayog, as well as 3IE for having me back and engaging with all of you on this very important topic, and seeing a lot of old friends. Let me also apologize for not sharing my screen. I'm in a remote rural village it's not even a village, it's a crossroads here in the Philippines. And you might hear some traffic behind me. Uh, but this is the only place where I can get a good connection enough to connect. So please bear with me. Again, apologies for that. So Marie, you asked about a secret recipe. I don't think that there is one. If there is, it's so secret, no one knows about it. Uh, they're more like ingredients that make sense out there. And let me just mention three from my experience. These ingredients might seem very obvious, but I think that there are some perspectives that might be interesting. The first is, I think, putting the government in the driver's seat. This may seem like a no-brainer. You know, why wouldn't the government be in a driver's seat in an evaluation? Well, I think that a lot of researchers in the past have felt that um, you don't want to uh, put the evaluee being the ones to actually pose the evaluation questions. And there's a trade-off. And if the main objective is accountability, then that would be difficult. But I think that we as evaluators have learned that the uh, gains to learning are much higher if the government is fully engaged. So, as you know, Marie, at 3IE, what we have this um, policy window for at the country level, in which we have generated resources to make sure that the government is the one that is actually posing the evaluation questions, and that really actually makes a real difference in terms of the ownership of government. So that's one thing, is putting the government in the driver's seat. I don't think it is as straightforward as it seems to be. The second is know your government. I think Kurti and others all mentioned the need for champions, and we have a couple of them with us. Mr. Krishnan certainly in India is a great champion. But I think what we've learned in our own experience is that it's very important to really identify who those champions are. We have some cases in which the champions are at the very tops of government. Uh, but if you don't have also champions who are going to be the ones who will allow the evaluators in, then that makes it really difficult. It's like pushing on a string. Here in the Philippines, for example, in our policy engagement, we had the Department of Education at one time at secretarial level saying, yes, we need evaluations, but at the ground level, we just didn't get any buy-in, and that didn't go anywhere. Sometimes it's the other way around. You have, in fact, great evaluation teams, but there's no buy-in at the top. Again, here in the Philippines, the Department of Social Welfare had a great history through the World Bank, actually, as well, of having evaluation of their programs, but the ministers changed, and the minister wasn't interested anymore, and that made it very difficult. So I think another lesson for us is to make sure that you know your champions and to cultivate them properly. Sometimes there are governments in which you have neither buy-in at the top nor at the bottom. And here, what we've learned is that you have to engage outside of government. And civil society then will be very important. So knowing who those champions are, I think are also important lessons for us. Um, uh, the last thing is third thing is to really make sure that we assess the motivations of those champions. Is it for accountability or learning? And I do think that most governments have been stressing accountability more, and that's a real issue because sometimes the learning agenda requires different kinds of data, and I think that um, building in that capacity on the ground will be informed by whether or not which of those motivations actually will drive the evaluation forward. Here in the Philippines, one lesson that we've learned is to make sure that you build that capacity, not just to know what evaluations are, but here we've found that helping build capacity on managing evaluations has been really important to get that buy-in in the future. So I'll leave it at that. Just three things is first, put the government in the driver's seat. Second, know who those champions in government are and uh, address them properly. And the third is to assess their motivation. One last thing, Marie, is want to add is it's also very important to know that any of these things can change over time. We all know Mexico and Carnival. There's a situation in which we had great buy-in, both at the top and at the bottom. And in what we've seen in just in the past year and a half in Mexico is that, again, with the change of government, that has made it very difficult even for the best evaluators in Mexico to move their agenda forward. So back to you.
Thank you, Manny. Excellent. And I think your last note of caution, I think, is important. You know, how fragile these systems still are, and depending on persons, and sort of a reminder to all of us to think: are there ways of making these systems less vulnerable, so to speak? The other thing that just struck me from what you talked about was the sort of the long and the short route. You know, the short route being you have a champion like Mr. Krishnan or somebody in government who can make things happen, and then but if you don't have that, what do we do? And you know, the longer route is through civil society you mentioned, but I do think that's a whole area we haven't yet properly tackled and figured out how that should be working. Now, Manny, I wonder, we're moving now into the second part of the panel, which is where you all have listened to each other and might have questions. And I would like to start with you, Manny, because your connection was quite fine and it might not be later. So if you have a question to one of the panelists, I'll hand it over to you.
Yes, Sami. And maybe I have a question both for Shamik and Mr. Krishna. Is that we've all talked about the availability of data and evidence, and I wonder whether in India the government is now more. You see that the government is more open to sharing that evidence with all researchers. In the past, I know that in some cases data has been difficult to obtain. And I wonder if the access to data is now much easier in the interest of evidence just being generated more generally, including by civil society, by the way. So that's my question.
Krishna, do you want to start?
Thank you very much. I think let me take off from the 2 points that Mr. Jimenez made right at the end. One which related to, you know, becoming two-person dependent or individual dependent, and I think that's one of the it tangentially touches on one of the questions in the Q&A box. And the other thing is, how do you share data? See, I think the important thing is to look to see how you institutionalize these arrangements, you know, create a framework within government which helps you institutionalize an arrangement, which makes sure that you don't pick one or two. It's not selective based on personal relations, or it's not based on something that you know, but you create a structure where you can engage. So one of the things that we did was we said, okay, it's not as if it's going to be an MOU with one agency or with one organization, but it's a template or a framework which we can adopt with a number of agencies. And that's precisely what happened. About 4 or 5 agencies came up. And then the second thing also is to create structures within that, you know, steering committees and advisory committees and so on, which actually look at what's coming out of this process of a study or a process of a policy dialogue, and then disseminating it within government, and also enabling people within government to engage effectively with that, to ask the questions they have, the doubts that they have, clarify issues, and then also see whether that is something you can then transmit or transport to another department. So these structures of engagement and structures of institutional follow-up are important. And I think after a point, what happens is you don't need one champion or one person who will be after this. There will be others who take interest in this because of the value that it generates. So I think that's an important thing. Of course, sometimes it may not survive a regime change of some kind, but I think in the Indian context, by and large, these mechanisms do tend to survive and do tend to go, because I mean, if there is value, then it continues from one government to another, because, okay, you have fairly strong civil service and a bureaucracy which can carry it from one stretch to another, but you have to do enough to socialize this within the system. The second element, especially on data, is I think one of the big questions we faced initially was the data sharing protocol. I mean, many researchers and others are interested in doing this because they then get a paper to publish, or they then, it becomes a kind of a research activity for them, and they write about it somewhere else. They talk about it in a variety of places. And for governments, sometimes that's a little disquieting. They're worried what happens if there's a negative feedback on one of these issues, or if it doesn't sound as good as you want it to sound. And it is a cause for concern. So we actually set in place, we have a fairly detailed protocol which is followed of the way in which the study reports are submitted, the way that the government agencies concerned get a chance to respond to what needs to happen. And finally, how do you decide to bring it out as a publication or report it to a wider public? And because you have these mechanisms, at least, there is an element of formality in the way that the whole thing gets done. People feel safer. It's not as if it's on the head of one individual saying you permitted information about this particular program to go out, and now what do we do? Interestingly, recently we had a scholar from the Kennedy School of Government doing a study on the way that our recruitment agency does its appointments and decides how people are placed, and how exactly the whole mechanism works. And again, interestingly enough, the recruitment agency, which is the Public Service Commission, borrowed from the publication protocol that we have put together as a template, saying, okay, we've followed all these steps, and therefore we can allow the scholar who's done this study, which has given us this input, which we can use internally, to also publish. So where all this helps is that systems and institutional frameworks are important. Governments are sensitive to what gets written about them, and very often you don't want negative stuff to get written. So you're constantly, there's very little incentive for officials to participate in a process where they think the feedback would ultimately be negative. It may not always be positive, but you need to sensitize them to this, and you need to have frameworks wherein somebody who is going forward and wanting to do something positive doesn't get penalized later. So putting in systematic ways of doing it, having protocols, having government circulars, having structures, committees, sometimes seems to be a little time consuming, but it does two important things. One, it institutionalizes it, figures out a way by which it can carries it forward, ensures that there are more champions who are brought into the process, more people who could get interested in the process, and last of all, it doesn't put any one person in the government system at too much of risk. It promotes one other thing which in government is generally lacking, which is a collaborative working style. So, one important thing that all of this does is people then tend to collaborate, not just with agencies outside government, but within government as well. So I think there are a number of positives which come out of this, but institutionalizing it is as important as anything else. Thank you.
Great, and I just want to remind people as well that there's been some answers to questions online. Also, do please send in further questions. And meanwhile, we will continue to also take questions and answers between panelists. Let me ask you, Sunita, whether you want to ask one of the other panelists something. Is there something you want to learn from them, something you want them to clarify further?
Sure. Thank you so much, Marie. And Mr. Krishnan answered one of the questions that I had put down around sort of, how we move beyond working with champions within government. And I think this issue of institutionalization, which he described in great detail, was super helpful, and I've transcribed it so that I can share it forward. But sort of building on that, I'd love to hear from Samik as well, given the bank's extensive experience working with states like Tamil Nadu, but Karnataka and others as well. When it comes, and states like Tamil Nadu are exemplary, there are already now both champions as well as institutional mechanisms. What would you recommend for a foundation like ours? What can we do to help enhance those capacities for evidence use in other states which may not already have these institutionalized structures, or even strong champions, in part because also the scale of some of the problems that they're dealing with are just so huge. Any tips of the trade, so to speak, that you could share?
Yeah, thanks, Sunita. Excellent question. I think, as you rightly said, there are India can be divided into various categories of states to work with in terms of champions and the way the engagement process goes. And Tamil Nadu definitely falls in a different category. I'm not saying that because Mr. Krishnan is there, but I think it does actually when you engage with them. Tamil Nadu in vis-a-vis a state like Orissa, Jharkhand, Bihar, Chhattisgarh, and the other side of India, particularly this side. And I have been experiencing a lot of work in Orissa particularly, and I know Gates have been involved in Orissa a lot in the work with the agriculture department, I think, and that is driven by a champion and again by individuals. So a lot of things are happening. So the tips is basically how the socialization process work, and definitely creating champions and building systems downstream is very important. I think they're just at the top level discussing strategies, aspects doesn't work. So when we worked in Orissa, also you are working in Orissa, I think the downstream work we did with various other departmental staff in terms of exposing them to things we are doing, definitely discussing, making them part of the entire discourse and helping them through, like the BOT model you're doing, the ADAPT program in DMGF itself is a big learning for other states to take forward as a model to work with in terms of build, operate, and transfer. And you are at the transfer stage, and you are definitely, you must be facing problems. But that's the way to go around about in other states also. I'm actually throwing back at you what you have done good as example as BMTF. In our case, I feel we lack a little bit of that kind of a thing because we are structured in a way to disburse. And that doesn't help us much in completing projects or providing the assistance. So we come from a very bank perspective in those states. So in our process to build institutions, capacities within the government systems, we somewhere become short-sighted because we have to close project, we have to show results, and we have to disburse and close the project in the end. And in that process, what we do, we miss the entire learning and evidence-based kind of approach to address some of the things that we are discussing here. So I think that's the real world we live in terms of operational aspects as well as the aspects of how much you go into learning from the process you go through in implementing the project. I think that balance is very critical. As team leaders, as people who engage with the government all the time in making this balance, you need to see where you want to put your weightage on. And also one of the things I see more and more, and I could put it as a question also, is that the overall M&E capacity or the evidence building capacity in the country itself, in India, is still is aspiring to be better than what it is today. Actually, if I put it in a very mild way, I would say it doesn't have that overall capacity, neither externally outside the system or within the system. I think my question would be Mr. Krishnan now, if I can take it from here, Mary, would be the key questions I am struggling with in various programs is most of this evaluation evidence building is coming from outside who are using government administrative data to come back and give you evidence, basically. Why we are not able to build capacity or institutionalize capabilities within the government systems to work with their own data and build it around, and how do you think a broader kind of a fraternity like sitting around here can help you build that, basically? So what do you see, and what are the 3-4 things we need to do on that?
I think you're absolutely right. Why do we need people from outside to look? Why can't you build capacity from within? Is a very important issue, and that's precisely one of the things we try to do. When we collaborate, the important thing that you're trying to do alongside is also enhance capacity within. That's one of the ways in which I sold the idea of the collaboration, saying that ultimately, when we work with JPAL or even with SRC for our household panel survey and so on, the way the idea was sold was that it's going to ultimately enhance capacity of departments within government to do the same thing. They're going to learn and then replicate it within. Sometimes, again, some of these departments are not resourced well enough, and you need to sort of add on to capacity with external agencies. And sometimes you may need a specific agency. You might need an external agency to do a large-scale survey, but then you do the analysis within. And for that, you need capacity. And sometimes it's difficult to ramp up some of the analytical capacity overnight. And that is always a problem. And again, some of the best talent is difficult to pay for. I mean, for government, on a government salary, for a 24/7 job, they may not be willing to come. But which is where I think one thing which is changing, I mean, whether it is 3IE, whether it's Gates Foundation, whether it is JPAL, all of these agencies, what I find really is a lot of youngsters, a lot of young people who want to contribute to public policy making process, or even all the young professionals in an agency like Niti Aayog. Many of them who, like me, maybe 20, 30 years ago would have tried to join the civil service are now actually dabbling with this, like it's almost like a gig economy for them. I mean, I interact with a lot of them. They work 3 years, 4 years, excellent talent, very bright people, very bright ideas, and then they want to move on. So there's no reason why government shouldn't leverage on that kind of talent if it's outside. So we need a combination of both. We need to do it in-house and we need to do it externally. And of course, the other big point is, we have the most data. We have the largest volume of data, and it's increasing all the time. And how we use it is critical. And it is even now suboptimally utilized. There are a number of other problems because, each department feels that somehow it is the most sensitive data. If you look at, tax-related data, it can throw up a lot of other insights. If I find the number of registrations in commercial taxes department is really growing very rapidly in one part of, or in one street or in one area, then I can actually probably use that for urban planning in terms of how the character of areas in the state is changing. But, the tax department would probably be very unwilling to share that data because they think there's something which is, confidential about it. So we have to overcome some of those problems. Similarly, if you look at crime data, I mean, it's very reluctantly that they share. But some data which we've been able to use very well is, say, the health insurance linked data. What is the health seeking behavior of people? Where are they going? Where are most of the patients coming from? Which hospitals are they going to? What kind of treatment are they going to? Then it really helps in terms of, then where do we need to focus on strengthening capacities in terms of the health system? So very interesting data gets thrown up through the health insurance mechanism. So one part of it is actually educating departments to be willing to share more data. Also building confidence, saying that when you share the data, it's not going to get used against you in a sense, because that's the other real fear a lot of them have. And third is also trying to, collaborate and build capacity to do this analysis. And we now have a nascent initiative of a data analytics unit. So we have a few agencies which work with government agencies, both the Department of Economics and Statistics and our e-governance agency, to see how we can do data analytics much better because of the sheer volume of data that we generate. So the possibilities are immense, and I think so far it'll be fair to say that we've sort of probably used only a very small proportion of it, and clearly competencies have to be developed, particularly in data analysis and looking at data a little more critically. Some of it needs to be cross-departmental within government, which in itself is a challenge, and some of it needs to be with agencies outside government. The problem also is, there are those confidentiality issues. How do you actually work with agencies in the capacity of a confidential advisor? I remember when I was in the IMF in our ED's office, we have this big issue of publication issues. And there were many countries which actually made this legitimate point that an agency like the IMF is a confidential advisor to government. So your credibility is much greater when you are a confidential advisor to us. If you're going to publish everything, then what we tell you is also going to be limited, and everything gets redacted. So to some extent, I think we have to make some of these little compromises, saying in certain cases, there would be a confidentiality requirement. For instance, we never allowed anyone to publish what they shared with us on the say the prohibition enforcement issue, because that's something which becomes sensitive and confidential within the system, but is extremely valuable as input. But because by then we had a trusted relationship, it was possible for them to share without looking at it. I mean, it's like it trades off against some other sort of more publicized effort they make in terms of what needs to happen. So I think there are a number of ways in which to deal with it. Internal capacity must be built. We are in the process. I can't say we are absolutely there. There needs to be more of it. Second is, it need not be entirely internal, because I think there's a lot of talent which can be accessed on an itinerant basis, literally outside of the government, which we need to be open to. And the third is, at least some of this data needs to be thrown open for a much wider analysis, so that more people can actually contribute. There could be insights which they give, which we can't think of. So, I mean, there could be crazy insights that could come out of it. So I think we need to keep it open for all of those possibilities.
Excellent, very, very interesting. Now, I'm mindful of time, but I want to, and we haven't gotten that many questions in, but there's one last one that I will see who of you would like to answer, from Priyanka Dua. She's asking, how can there be more incentives for policymakers and government to use existing evidence? And this is something that also from 3IE's perspective, we're particularly interested in, because you may know we have a very huge, we have our development evidence portal with sort of over 4,000 impact evaluations, over 700 systematic reviews. There's a lot of rich existing evidence. And of course there are other sources, but we are seeing that lots of both in government and also development institutions are not necessarily fully taking advantage of what we already know. We have in over the last year, and partly brought along by Corona, found ways of sort of bringing that evidence to bear and to provide advice into ongoing policy discussions and policy decisions through sort of help desk formats, where you identify a policy relevant question, and we find out what existing evidence do we have on this, and provide sort of 2-page briefs that are sort of tailored to the situation. I think this looks quite promising, but we have found that sort of using existing evidence is not sort of always happening. Do any of you maybe ask any of you to, I don't know if Sunita, you want to kick it off? Does the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, do you sort of have a way to bring existing evidence into your decision making? And I'll ask one of the others who would like to volunteer to answer it as well. Maybe Krishnan from the government perspective. Sunita?
Sure. I mean, I think when we, I think the timeliness with which one is able to rapidly synthesize evidence, when policymakers need it. I think there are many, many instances when actually policymakers want to use evidence and they want to know what the evidence says. And unfortunately, I think that the research community is sometimes we're not able to respond, not able to also respond in ways that make that synthesis readily applicable, to that specific instance. And one example, that I've been really excited about is the partnership between the George Institute and NHSRC, with Rajni Ved, which she was the director, was spearheading this of these rapid evidence syntheses, that would be done literally within the space of like a week, if needed, in service of a very specific decision. Because I think, as Mr. Krishnan pointed out, some of these decisions that policymakers need to make in government, have to happen, in real time, and we are not able to respond. Over.
Excellent. Mr. Krishnan, would you like to add?
I think the biggest incentive you can give a policymaker is a better policy decision which gets taken. I mean, a decision you're more comfortable with in terms of having considered all options. We never have as much data or information as we would like to have when we make that decision, but the more of it we have, the happier we are. So that's one thing we certainly ask. And, I right now work in the finance department, which is primarily advisory, but then, we ask most of the questions which tend to get asked post whenever there is a new proposal that comes in. So having input is always useful. I don't think we really need an incentive to ask to be incentive to use these use the evidence. We are really looking for it. Sometimes it's just that you're not aware. So an outreach by agencies like 3IE and things certainly helps, so that we have some awareness of what is available out there and where we can get it from. The second thing also is sometimes to actually just sit down and do policy dialogues. Saying. Sit down with the secretary, sit down with the department and ask them, what are the big challenges that you're looking at? And then see, what is it that you have in your data bank of evaluation studies or development studies, which would fit the kind of issue that they have. And sometimes some of these inputs are also very, very tangential. Recently, I was finding some information on, I think it was IDR or one of those networks, which actually dealt with agriculture insurance. So, I mean, which I could share with our agriculture department people to look at what we can do next time around. So I think there is a fair bit of hunger and need for this information. It's probably partly also the awareness of where it would be available and how it can be quickly accessed, which would really help. I think that outreach will certainly help. And a good starting point in governments is usually the planning or the finance departments, because they are the ones who have all these questions. The actual implementing departments tend to take it as whatever their field formation tells them is the important thing. But sometimes when you go back to them with an alternate viewpoint, they're always willing to.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much to the panel. I've been notified that I need to let you go because there are other exciting events happening. But thank you so much for these excellent contributions and discussion that we've had on strengthening pathways from evidence to action. I think we've been joined basically by champions from government, from funders, from development institutions, from evaluation organizations, and we've really sort of looked at many of the possibilities, but also some of the remaining constraints that we have to work with. So with that, really would like to thank you for joining us, and thanking NITI Aayog and DMEO for organizing this, and to my 3IE colleagues who have been made this possible. So thank you very much, and see you in the other sessions.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Bye. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.